So now I do have the privilege to ask you a few questions before everyone else. And I want to discuss a few themes that are coming forward. I mean, in your presentations, some of you brought to light and explained the important work that you do that strives to support and indeed platform marginalized voices, which in this context are the voices of African women, especially Black African women. But these presentations have also already begun to highlight the discrepancies in who gets to represent you and how do we change that. Indeed, as Kemi has shown, it's often white directors, there are often white writers, and it's predominantly men as well, who are narrating through these films, novels, and in journalism what are African stories. And not only African stories based in the continent, but also in the diaspora. And to add another level to that, it's not just African stories, it's also the stories of African women. And so there's a double entanglement where not only are you facing the issues of racism and colonialism and those histories that remain embedded into institutions today, but also sexism, and how that sexism can be replicated even in presumably decolonial narratives as well. And so I want to maybe begin the conversation with more on still the obstacles to be able to bring these threads out, to really bring home, in a way, what we're up against in representing women of color, Black women, Sub-Saharan women. And maybe I can start with you, Kemi, because I thought one of the things that you said, which was very interesting, is that representation isn't just misrepresentation, in that it is also constitutive. So even those who are being misrepresented often lose other images of themselves, other images that they can put out there. It narrows the range of those stories that we have. And I was wondering if maybe you can talk from your personal experience or the experiences of colleagues and friends as well, but maybe you could delve a bit deeper into what you mean by this or how you've seen this play out.
Yeah, I think is this working? I can do it. Oh, perfect. I think representation is really hard because there's, for instance, on the festival circuit, my film was the only Ugandan film on that circuit. And so representation becomes hard because it's a 20-minute film and everyone wants to see themselves in that 20-minute film. So you see this a lot with content about African Americans or Africans. They're like, well, that's not my story. And I'm like, I understand that, because the minute I try and represent everyone's stories is when I fall into tropes, is when I fall into stereotypes. And so it's very tricky because everyone wants to see it when you're so, when you're so marginalized. And so you have to sacrifice getting the vote from everyone for authenticity and telling the story you know how. Like I said, the reason I want to set up that grant is because there's certain stories I cannot tell. I have to pass the mic. But in the meantime, I know how to tell the story through my lens. But in terms of what you're saying, another obstacle is you want to succeed as a filmmaker. There are certain images you know will do well. There are certain stories you know will do well on the festival circuit. And I catch myself constantly because it takes years of unlearning. And anyone who sits here and says that they have not digested what they've been told about themselves is false. Because I think that's why it's important for me to see happy images of African women, because we cannot be what we cannot see, like I said. So if I'm constantly seeing that we're void of joy, that we're always upset, that we're constantly oppressed, that's what I expect of my life, and that's what I'm going to subconsciously attract. But if I see that we're prospering, if we're happy, if we're joyful, I can suddenly tap into those spaces. But a trap I fall into is I was thinking about my first feature, and I always work on 5 scripts at a time. It's just how I work. But I was choosing which script between 2 scripts, and I was choosing this one particular script, and I had to ask myself, why am I choosing that particular story? And when I'm honest with myself, I'm like, oh, this will do well in the West. This will do well in America, because it employs a certain narrative that fits well with the Western lens. And so what I did was I chose the opposite.
Maybe I can pass that question on also into Lanyende and Helen, because I think while this is talking about the film industry, I think similar issues occur in journalism and in writing novels as well. And I'm wondering, in your project, have you had, yes, can you tell us more? You've already told us a bit about how you have trying to navigate these tropes and trying to navigate being the storyteller of another person's story, so to speak. Could you elaborate maybe a little more on how you also navigate who your audience is and what they can take away from these stories?
First off, I think it's important to say that as people who are involved in nonfiction, we do have, I guess, the luxury of having reality be so much more complicated than maybe a single narrative that is presented to you as a interesting packet to be sold to the West or whatever. So I think that's like, I mean to say that because reality is always so weird and complicated, and we don't have to structure a story because the story has happened. Like when Vieux-Henri is telling his story to us, it's like this is his life. Like he's already choosing what he's telling us and what he's not telling us. So that is already like a pre-selection that is happening, which makes our lives easier than, for example, it does yours. But at the same time, we work in an industry that is at the same time super obsessed with Black people and at the same time totally ignores Black people. Journalism is no different. I think it's even more the case. We hyper-visualize them when it comes to violence, when it comes to gangs, when it comes to all these negative stories, and we completely ignore them when it comes to anything else that we have to do with history, with telling stories, with telling positive stories, but also negative ones, you know, like just the more individual, the more real, the more complex. So I think that's one thing that is very, very obvious. And at the same time, something which is also very difficult when you're working in journalism is that the tendency to exoticize is super, super strong. So like, oh, we're coming to this place, like the air is filled with, I don't know, like something exotic, and then women's hips are moving side to side, you know, like this kind of stuff happens also a lot in journalism. It happens a lot in fiction too, but I find it very interesting that people who do not know anything about the Black people living in Europe try to tell their stories in ways that are highly, highly violent. And when it comes to our audience, that's something when we think about how we write, then I think because our audience are people like us, we are so much more careful to not fall into those same mistakes. We're not perfect, but that's why we ask a lot of other people to read and reread our stuff, because I mean, our audience is not what when we were pitching this story, you know how many people told us, like, this is not a typical story for the blah 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 reader or the fill in the blank reader, and it was like, are you for real? Because I am one of those readers, and I would read that story, and I think you are very much underestimating your readership.
And that's ironic because the word blank in Dutch means white. So fill in the whiteness. And I think, if I understood correctly, what you were saying about film is that writing fiction may be like more writing fiction may be more sensitive to tropes than just writing nonfiction.
No, that's not what I said. I meant to say. I mean to say. I think we have already a filter there, which makes it easier for us not to fall into tropes.
Oh, because of those people that we're
Because we're talking to real people who had a real life that was complex and all these things.
Yeah.
Maybe I can pass on the question to you, Liz, because you've created a platform which is exactly trying to offer a space and a visible space to women in Sub-Saharan Africa to put their voice out there. And maybe we can address the issue of filtering a little in this, because I'm curious, you discussed it a little, Tsitsi, but I'm also curious how it occurs in a platform like Calabash, because this is surely, the way I can see it, at least, an ideal platform for many, many women in an African context. But how do you sometimes find obstacles, even in that process?
Maybe to relate it to something else that we did. We have a festival, and we put out a call for bands to come and to the festival and perform. And out of 52 bands that applied, only 2 were women bands. Yeah. So from this place of asking ourselves whether women were, we were like, okay, so where are these women? Where are these women who can tell the stories? And so when we set up Calabash, we told the women, you know what, you're a banker, you're a wife, you're a lawyer, it doesn't matter, you have a story to tell, yeah? So bring that story, tell it. You might tell it in a shitty way, but you're telling the story, you know? And by you telling that story, then the next time you're telling a story, you're like, oh, I can improve on this, and I can tell this story better. Yeah, and so yeah, and that's the whole preface of the work that we do, especially with the women. So Calabash is an amazing platform because it gives the women that. And the thing I also like about Calabash is from the onset, the organization that I run, we are funded heavily by donors, and sometimes the donor gives you the narrative. That this is the narrative you must see for us to give you the money, yeah? But for Calabash, we are very specific. We're like, we need donors or people who support us that do not tell us what narrative we are giving. And Africania is here, and the one who are donors, and it's amazing that you don't tell us what narrative to give. And that's very important even for the women that we work with, so yeah.
And maybe I could also ask you, Tsitsi, because in that there is the relation between money and power is not a new one, and the ability that money has to tailor who is speaking as well and how they speak. And I'm very curious, you've had an amazing and very long career. Have you seen that, well, the question would be, have you seen that relation throughout, and has there been any change? But then maybe another question on top of that would be, how have things perhaps changed? If there is change occurring, how is it occurring? If it's not in relation to money and power, what are other ways we are pushing different narratives and having room and space for different voices?
Yeah, Akeisha, thank you. Is it on? No, not yet. Yeah, no, it is. Yeah, power is power, and we have different forms of it. You know, we have money, which is a potential power because it enables you to do things that change reality. We have political power, another kind of power. We have gender-based power. You can do things because of your gender. We have race-based power. And so all these powers act in the same way to enable you to change things. And so definitely that power that is in a film, which you call constitutive, by which I imagine that you meant when we watch a film, we take in things that determine who we become. It actually doctors the DNA of our subjectivity, as it were. This is what film does to you. So there's obviously going to be a link. And also, of course, something that is as potent as film in determining our imaginary, which is what you were talking about, Kelly, about having these stories fed back to us. Something that is that potent is obviously going to be associated with the other power bases. And we shouldn't think that this has happened by accident. This has actually happened by design. The whole idea to want to represent is how we establish some kind of play over our environment. This is why I am here today, and we have other people here today saying, we want to tell our stories. Because telling your story is an act of power. So this urge is within us, and it's as old as humankind. And we have developed different ways of doing it. Now, the thing about film is that it bypasses, there is a level at which film bypasses the cortex, cognitive thinking, and goes directly more to the older, more limbic parts of the brain, because you're taking it into your eyes. And so it can go straight. You don't have to process that image as much as you have to process a word. And then again, the way that editing has developed, it has been developed to mimic dream, this illusion of reality, so that you suspend your belief. Now, these are things that are built into film in order to make it have that impact on you. So when you see people who have developed this system, depriving other people of entry into that system, there is a reason for it. Which is why I would really applaud those people who are funded by organizations like Africalia or the Ford Foundation that do not tell you what narrative you have to tell. Because generally, you will find that a lot of our filmmaking comes, first of all, it comes from donors. So what is happening with the donor? It is not the person telling the story. You are told that the problem is your subject matter. The HIV is your subject. So we are sitting there consuming the trajectory of HIV. Or we are told poverty is your subject matter. So we are sitting there consuming the trajectory of poverty. And I cannot believe that people do not understand that this is what is going on. I think it is known. So, in fact, I've spoken a lot, so I won't go to the second question.
No, I think that's actually really illustrative anyway, because I think talking about whether it's known or not, I do think maybe we can go back to this idea that you proposed, Kemi, of the cognitive disruptor, because this is the question of how known is it, and how do we disrupt it? How do we disrupt these images? And then how do we disrupt power in turn? And I want to probe you a little more on this wonderful figure, because I want to ask, how do you see us all becoming, even those on top of the social hierarchy, let's say, like white men, becoming cognitive disruptors?
I think anything that's a cognitive disruptor is anything that upsets the status quo. So Africa Film Festival saying we're going to put a black woman on their poster and she's going to choose what image it is, whether we like it or not. That's cognitive disrupting. You are disrupting the status quo, which says, because you were saying people are obsessed with black people but also ignoring. People are obsessed with black images but not interested in black people. So usually you might see a black woman, but she has no say in how she looks. She has no say in what the image is. But to disrupt is just to change the status quo. Is to hold a festival like this and say, here's the mic, you tell us. This is disrupting. Because as soon as I have the mic, metaphorically and literally, I have the power. And so I think I wrote an article called That Hustle Privilege. And I'm also very passionate about us owning our privilege and leaning into privilege to close the gap. Because I think sometimes we can also lean into our oppression. So even me, I can say, oh, I'm an African woman, I'm black, I'm very oppressed. I have a lot of privilege. I live in LA, I have access to studios, I have an agent, I went to really good schools. I have never worried about where my next meal is. So I must lean into that and say, okay, I have access to this. So how do I close the gap between me and that other young Ugandan filmmaker? Which is why I started to look into, I want to set up a grant. That is my way of disrupting. So I think we must always analyze where we are on that hierarchy, because it's more complex than the four. And the lower and lower it is, you have to close that gap and be aware of your privilege.
And I think this also speaks into the significance of having an all-female crew as well, the significance of having hubs that can innovate, that can educate and network too. And we saw the great work that you do with that, Tsitsi, and also Liz. And I want to be able to ask you, Liz, how do you see other digital content platforms taking their lead, in fact, especially in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, or how do you see them taking your lead? And possibly, I want to ask you, how do you ensure that these spaces also integrate an intersectionality of women voices? So obviously, we're talking about Black women from Sub-Saharan Africa, but also LGBTQI, working class women, etc.
Maybe the biggest platform we have for this would be YouTube. And the thing is, a lot of content gets lost in it. Like a lot of amazing content is created, but there's no that one platform that makes it seen more. So the preface of Calabash was also to get all this amazing content that's out there and aggregate it. That means we get more views for the content that's being produced. So in terms of, is there any other platform that's doing what you're doing? I don't think we have that yet. Yeah, which is amazing. And as I said, working especially with women and having all female crew, we've done that, and I think it was amazing. And as she said, that it's very hard to get women who would be DOPs, who would be holding the camera and things like that. But you see, if we start having platforms and start planting the seeds that this can happen, then more and more you start seeing people doing it. And more we've started seeing people coming out of their cocoons and starting to share these stories.
I'm also very curious about, and this I can pose to you both hopefully, is that there are stories of ourselves and of people with similar heritage, similar backgrounds, that we're not always going to like. And these can be very real stories too. And so I want to play on something that you said, which is full authenticity can be a trap. And I think it's a very wonderful way to also bring in this idea that images, content, even of ourselves that we produce are filtered. And I'm curious how you see in writing, I think as well, like writing is a very powerful tool for also demonstrating the stories we don't necessarily like but need to be said. And I'm curious, your project, has this become an issue for you? And if it has at any point, how have you navigated it or talked about navigating it?
So to me, that question actually also like develops onto what they were saying, because in the way I interpret your question about stories we do not want to hear, one of the things that I often say, and that I also wanted to write down while we're talking, is that what you said about consuming the images that we were told about ourselves and then having to unlearn that. One of the stories that we don't like to hear as Black people is also that because we haven't learned to lean into the privilege that she talked about, we consume these images, and because we no longer know who we are outside of that struggle, outside of trauma. So we continue to formulate and add to those tropes and stories that center around pain, essentially. And that is not to negate the importance of telling pain, importance of telling the very real traumas that we go through. But for example, when we started the project, one of the tropes that were told about an emerging Afropean identity is that, oh my God, the whole Black Lives Matter movement, it's coming to Europe, and every Black person in Europe is involved, and we're gonna ride around and we're gonna disrupt the shit out of everything. And then when we got to the neighborhoods, the African neighborhoods, the Black neighborhoods, the Afro-Caribbean neighborhoods, it was well, actually, the people that are invested in basically centering their identity around something that was created in America and from a lens of Western Blackness, are mostly youth that are in universities, young people that are very academic, that are very intellectualist, and that hold positions of power within the community, but that might not be very comfortable with leaning into that privilege, and more so lean then into an activism that is not very truthful and reflective and representative of the communities as a whole, as complex as they are, because there is no such thing as the Black community, the African community. And this hit me one time when I was invited to speak at this conference on Black feminism in Europe. And it was very Anglophone driven, and it was a very good, very necessary conference. But then again, the language, the lingo, the subject matter at hand that we were in the way in which we were discussing things was a way that my mother could never relate to, my own mother. And I just broke down in tears during my presentation, because I was what are we doing here, and who are the who are these women that we're defending the so-called rights of, if they do not even understand what we're saying. So yeah, in intellectualism, the hierarchy of intellectualism and this respectability politics that refuses to lean into privilege, to look at the ways in which we can close that gap, is something that we've struggled with in the project. Definitely, yeah, definitely.
Do you have something?
I mean, she said everything so beautifully. It was such a journey. It really was to learn to just. And we still argue about these things. Even yesterday, we were doing editing, and she wanted to change the word, and I was like, that's not how he said it. And he said it in a more politically incorrect way, and then she's like, yeah, but so it's we keep having these discussions. But the best thing was like we were walking around with a woman who's helped us a lot, Mireille Robert. I don't know if you know her. We were walking around Matoge, and she, like, at the end, we were laughing at something like, I don't know, like, oh, this white girl, she has braids, you know. We were laughing about it, and then Mireille was like, why are you laughing? And I was like, yeah, I don't know, like, cultural appropriation. It's like, that's not really a thing here, like this is not really how we feel about,
This is not really our urgency.
Yeah, and we were like
people are being marginalized, and you're worried about grades.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, okay, like you have a very different perspective on this, and you might be right, you might not be right, but you know, we learned something, and it's very interesting how, you know, the internet and all this stuff, all this stuff happening, and at the same time, what's happening in communities is even more vital and urgent, but the two don't always align.
Maybe I can also finally just pass a similar question on to you, Cici, about telling the stories that maybe a certain audience doesn't want to hear, or has to be framed in a certain way, and what a director, what a writer has to go through that process to think, no, am I going to stay truthful to the, let's say, un-PC-ness or of the complexity or but of the complexity of it, how you've had a very long career in this. How have you navigated these stories?
I think that's a really important question, and it deserves more time than we can give it today, because there's so many aspects to it. There is the young Zimbabwean, for example, who's been watching YouTube and has never been to the States, but now speaks with a fake African-American accent, can no longer sing in Shona, and really is not producing music that I think will sell anywhere outside Zimbabwe. I remember we had a meeting once where we were discussing the creative industries in Zimbabwe. This was back in 2007, when government was promising us to do something about it. And one of the young women there, who is quite a well-known singer in the country, said, well, the good thing about Zimbabweans is that we can imitate well. So this is what Kemi was talking about, and which you were talking about, being constituted by somebody else's story. So there's that aspect to it. And now sometimes it's almost impossible to get beyond what has been constituted, because that person is now so invested in that constitution that they are threatened. You know, the ego feels under attack. If you say no, but you have to do something different. When I made my short film, Kare Kare, and I screened it in Zimbabwe, it's taken from a myth. And my thinking was that, you know, Zimbabwe is a small country, 14 million people. I cannot create a sustainable creative economy ecosystem with 14 million people. So I have to look for stories that will resonate beyond Zimbabwe's boundaries. So I was thinking that myth and legend and folklore are those kinds of stories, because they travel in regions. So this is the story of a man who eats his wife, which my grandmother told me. So when people came and saw this film, I had people literally calling me up and saying, Tsitsi, do you think we can retell the old stories? You know, people could not conceive that it was possible, because that idea of your cultural identity being something that you can actually narrate had been erased. You know, so we have a lot of work to do. First of all, to remind people that you have a cultural identity. You have sources from which you can draw your material, and also to give them the tools for using it. My one privilege, I think, is that I was educated as a young child at a time when many women were perhaps not being educated. And I was exposed to other environments, because I spent some of my very early childhood from about 2 to 6 in England. And I wasn't even with my parents, I was fostered out. So I've had lots of experiences that were outside the norm. You know, when I spoke to my parents about this, they said, but Siti, we didn't know there was anything wrong, because at home we have the extended family and you go and live with your grandmother. But here, so okay, the woman I was fostered out to was also elderly, so my parents are thinking, oh, she's with a grandmother. But this happens to be white in a coastal town in England in the 1960s, you know. So I had all those things to grapple with. So I think I learned early that you've just got to stake your space. And I've leaned into those two privileges. But the other real privileges of being able to satellite around power, I'm still working on it.